Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be going through my September wrap up, and I would just like to say that despite the fact that September was so busy, as evidenced by my late release of this video, it was actually a really successful reading month. I read a lot of books that I really enjoyed, and even the books that I didn't enjoy as much, there were still things that I found fulfilling about reading them. And I will get into that a little bit later as I do kind of the star breakdown and talk about the different books that I made it through in September. But like I said, just a very successful reading month overall. September, as I'm sure it does with many people, always puts me in a great reading mood. I feel like that back to school time is the perfect time to pick up books. It just makes me excited to read and pick up new things, which can be dangerous because I also am on a book buying ban for the rest of the year. So no new books, only books from my physical TBR. That's all that I'm going to be making it through. But it is an exciting time, and there are usually lots of good releases at this time of year. So I will just have to make note of them all so that I can read them in the new year. But we'll jump in because there are 11 books. I made it through 11 books in September, which was very successful. And I want to be able to talk about a couple of them in a little greater depth. So I will get right into it. In terms of a star breakdown, this month I had 1 2.5 star book, 1 3-star book, 3 4-star books, 4 4.5 star books, and 2 5-star books. So very successful overall. I enjoyed so much of what I read in September. It felt like the month just kind of flew by because I was liking the books that I was reading so much. I also started a couple of books that I didn't get to finish in September. And I guess I'll just talk about those now because if not, I'll forget about them by the end of the video. But there are 2 that I am still actively reading into October, and that is Fall of Hyperion, which was the channel buddy read for September. It just didn't grab me immediately, and so I kept putting it off to read other things, and I have made the executive decision to switch over to audiobook. So this is now going to be my audiobook for the month of October, and I will listen to it throughout the month, and then I will weigh in on that in my October wrap-up. The other book that I began reading in September was The First Binding, which is a new release for this year. And it's a really big book, so I just didn't get time to finish it in September. And I will finish that one in October, and then that will make it into my October wrap-up. But I tried to account for that when I was making my October TBR, knowing that I had 2 fairly chunky books that I was going to need to integrate there. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through my September reads in order so I can take them from my reading journal. And the first book that I read of the month was the 3rd volume of the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. So I have been talking about these books all throughout the year. These are cultivation, fantasy, romance novels. This is the 3rd volume of Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, which is my favorite of this author's series, and I continue to have a great time. I have read this before, but I read a fan translation, and these are the official English translations, and it's nice to have them bound up. The editions of the books are very lovely. They're all illustrated. I have a fantastic time reading them. I think that they are great. I love the plot. I love the characters. I love the angsty, high stakes romance. And there's a lot of heartbreak in these books. Some really difficult things happen. And the evil part of me really enjoys that. So still having a great time reading through this series. And if you like any of those things that I just mentioned, then I would recommend that you at least give the first volume a chance. After that, I continued in my read of Monster. So I read volume 2, and I guess I could just include the next one here as well. Volume 2 and volume 3 of Monster. And I gave both of those 4 stars. So I'm still really enjoying my read through of this this manga series. I'm reading this along with Jimmy, and we are hoping to do a chat at the end of the series. So once we have both finished the series, we're going to either record a chat or do a live chat and hopefully talk about why this would be a good introductory manga for people who haven't read a lot from that particular type of book. So I'm still really liking it. The story overall is very tense. There's a lot of really emotional moments, and it just keeps you wanting to turn the page. So I again, really enjoying that experience. I really like the main character, and it's fun and a little bit stressful to see what happens to him and the kinds of situations that he needs to find his way out of. After that, my third book of the month was Hamnet. So this one I have talked about a little bit if you watched my 5-star predictions kind of follow-up video. So Hamnet had been one of my 5-star predictions that I made at the beginning of this year, and it came so close. So this was one of my 4.5-star books. And actually, at the beginning of the reading experience, I wasn't sure if this was going to even end up being 4 stars because it did not immediately pull me in. Hamnet is quite popular on BookTube, but if you have not heard of it, it is historical fiction, and it follows the story of Shakespeare and his wife, whose name in the book is Agnes. They call her Agnes in the audiobook, so I would have said Agnes, but I also am pretty sure that her name was, or at least historically, like they refer to her as Anne. So I'm not sure, but her story of meeting Shakespeare and them kind of falling in love, creating a family together, and then of course the tragic end of their son Hamnet's life. So Hamnet, and this is not a spoiler, this is, you know that this is what the book is about when you go into it. Hamnet, their son, passed away very young due to the plague, and it is about how Shakespeare's play Hamlet is kind of a manifestation of his grief. This book seems to be pretty hit or miss. Some people really love it because of the lyrical writing, the exploration of grief, and they just have an interest in historical fiction. I really enjoyed it, but I can see people not enjoying it because the book that you get, I feel, is not the book that is advertised to you. So when I went into this book, I was expecting it to be about Shakespeare's grief and how his writing of the play Hamlet came from the loss of his son. And ostensibly, that is what it's about, but that is a very, 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 very small portion of the book right at the end. What this is about is Shakespeare's wife and her life, how they met, how her marriage to Shakespeare impacted her, and then her journey through motherhood and her experience of grief. So interestingly enough, Shakespeare is never actually called Shakespeare in this book, which I believe was an intentional choice on the part of the author. But I think the reason that she chose to do that becomes clear as you read through the book and as you make it toward the end. But it still had a huge emotional impact on me. So reading that book, especially the second half, with the really raw depiction of loss and grief, and specifically a mother's grief, it was a lot. Like, I felt on the cusp of tears the whole time. And I didn't actually cry, which is unusual because books make me cry a lot of the time. I've said this a million times. I'm not a very big crier in real life, but I cry a lot when I'm reading. I guess that is how I find my catharsis. But I think I knew if I started crying about this book that I just might never stop. Like, it was like a knife to the chest reading this book. So just be warned before you go in that it is a fairly heavy exploration of grief and loss, and specifically the loss of a child. So definitely difficult topics all around. But the writing is really beautiful. I think that it's easy to get pulled in by the lyricism of her writing style, but just be aware that what the book is really more of an exploration of personhood and motherhood and loss of a child rather than the experience of Shakespeare's grief and how that then, I guess, was sublimated into the creation of Hamlet. So just know that that is not really what the story is about, even though the book is kind of marketed in that way. After that, I read Fairy Tale. So this was a big one. This was the book that everybody was reading in September. So when Stephen King's new fantasy release, Fairy Tale, came out, I feel like everybody was reading it. The people who love Stephen King, the people who don't really love Stephen King, just like everyone on BookTube seemed to be reading Fairy Tale. And I also read it. I actually bought it on ebook because I knew that my physical copy would not arrive for like a week or 2 weeks until post-release. And I am happy that I did that because I'm happy that I read it along with everybody else. And my feelings are definitely mixed, but mixed leaning toward positive. So I ended up giving this book 4 stars. And I had a very similar reading experience, I think, at least based on what I have seen in the reviews that I have watched and the discussions that I have seen. I had a very similar experience as many other readers. So this book is a portal fantasy. So we start off in our world, and then the main character is able to access another magical world. What we get, and that is the setup of the book, like, you know that is going to happen. That is how it is, advertised. That's what's on the back. You know that that's what you're getting going into it. The beginning of the book is fairly lengthy. So like the first 30% of the book takes place in our time. And if you are a person who enjoys Stephen King's slice of life style writing, then you'll really love that first 30% of the book. And I really, really loved it. Like, that was a 5-star reading experience for me, to the point that when we reached the portal fantasy element of the book, I almost didn't want it. Like, I knew this was Stephen King's new fantasy release, and I knew that there were going to be fantasy elements, but I didn't really want them anymore because he had sucked me in so much with this ordinary story with like the small sprinklings of like the fantastic or the horrific that you see in those first, like, however many couple hundred pages. But then that's what I wanted to continue. So it took a lot of time to acclimate to the fantasy portion of the story. And then Stephen King makes some choices in that second third of the book that you might really like or you might not like at all. And for me, it definitely slowed the pacing down. And that was a little bit disappointing because I had been so engaged. I had been wanting to read. And then all of a sudden there was this total shift in perspective, in approach. And I was just like, whoa, this is almost like whiplash. What's happening? And I think that a lot of people had that similar experience. However, then the latter, like the third of the novel, that last 30%, I really liked again, and I really enjoyed the way that the book ended. I really liked the literary allusions. I liked the type of magic that he integrated into the story. I liked the grand reveal at the end. Like, everything else I enjoyed. And so as I was sitting back and wondering like how I should rate this book, how I really felt about it, I had to divorce what I thought this book was going to be from what it actually was. Because as someone who has been waiting for a fantasy release for such a long time, I had a lot of expectations that were unfair to the novel. For example, I wanted some Major Dark Tower tie-ins. Stephen King and this book do not owe me any Major Dark Tower tie-ins, but that's what I went in expecting, and I really thought that that was going to be there. I really thought that I was going to get that, and so it was a disappointment that I had placed on the novel by myself. I had also expected to get some of the same ideas or terms or manifestations that we get in The Talisman, which is also a portal fantasy by Stephen King. So I thought that some of the same ideas, some of his unique types of ideas that are in that book, I thought we might see similar things in Fairy Tale. And so then I was a little bit disappointed by that. But again, that was a totally unfair disappointment because it was my own expectation and not something that the novel had ever promised to give me. So I had to take a little bit of time to really think about how I felt about this book on its own without any of my preconceptions or expectations piled on it. And to me, it was still a really enjoyable book. I think it would be a good one for anybody excuse me, who has not been experienced with Stephen King before, somebody who wants to know what his writing style is like but doesn't want something super scary. I don't think that it is a book that you cannot recommend to anyone. I don't think that it's a book that I look back on and am unhappy that I read it. It just took me a little bit to kind of temper those expectations. So is it a new favorite for me? No. But did I enjoy the process of reading it? Yes, very much so. So that is how I felt about Fairy Tale. After that was a book that I really enjoyed and wrapped up a series. So that was Fall of Kings by David Gemmell. And I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. And similarly to Hamnet, actually, at the beginning of this third book, I wondered if it was going to rank as highly as the others in the series for me. I wondered how I was going to feel about the way that the series had been wrapped up. For anybody who doesn't know, this was Gemmell's last published work, and he actually passed away before the book itself had been completely written. So his wife, who I believe her name is Stella Gemmell, took over the writing of the book. He had allegedly extensively planned things, and so she was filling in the gaps, what he couldn't do. And I think that I don't know that you can tell that it's a totally separate writing style. Like if someone had passed me the book and said, read this, it wasn't so blatant that I would be like, wow, was this a ghostwriter? Like I had no idea. It was not like that, but it certainly was less smooth than the other two novels. I feel like things were a little bit more bumpy. The threads did not come together as seamlessly as they had in previous novels. But for a novel that had to be completed by another author, I think that she did a very good job of wrapping up this series. I really, really, really enjoyed the ending. The book as a whole, I felt like the pacing was maybe not quite as good as the first two. There were definitely a couple of instances where it flagged a little bit, but the other two books are kind of breakneck speed. You don't want to put them down. You're racing through the whole time. This one is very battle focused. So there's a lot of separate battles and you're kind of hopping around from battle to battle. And so your mileage is going to vary on that. If you're someone who really likes combat in fantasy, then this might end up being your favorite of the trio. There were some parts that I really enjoyed, and there were certainly some scenes that are like all-time highs for the series. There are some beautiful, heartbreaking, emotional scenes. Like this book still managed to squeeze a lot of emotion out of me. And like I said, I'm very happy with the way that it wrapped up. I love the way that Gemmell has taken this story and made it his own. It really reminds me of The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. It is just a retelling of this period of history that doesn't feel a lot like other retellings. It feels very grounded in reality. There are big scenes, big battles, big moments from the Trojan War that we are expecting that play out in very different ways than you may be expecting, but ways that feel very organic and very enjoyable. So I really liked it. I loved this trilogy as a whole. For me, I think the second book was my favorite, but I have no complaints about this conclusion. I thought that it was an excellent book. I may not have loved every beat of the story, but I think overall it was still really enjoyable. After that, we had my 2 5-star books. So I read 2 5-star books in a row. And the first was Piranesi. So this was another one of my 5-star predictions. A book that many people who watch the channel had told me that they thought that I would give 5 stars. And you are absolutely right. Piranesi made big buzz on BookTube like 2 years ago, like the end of 2 years ago, probably when it was first released. And a lot of people were reading it and gushing about it. So I'm just going to kind of throw my hat in the ring. I think that this was a phenomenal book. It's the kind of book where you don't really want to know a lot going into it. I was expecting it to be kind of dark and mysterious and whimsical. And it was all 3 of those things. But it was also very emotional. I was not expecting the range of emotions that I would feel as I read this book, including sadness. Like some parts of this are really sad, but in such a good way, like in a squeezing your heart kind of way. So I'm really glad that I loved it as much as I did. It's such a short little book. I will absolutely reread it in the future. It's the kind of book that's going to be interesting to reread because I imagine that it is a very different experience the second time around. I feel like reading it for the first time is something special and unique, but I think there will be a lot to enjoy the second time around as well. So Piranesi, absolutely 5 stars for me. Really, really enjoyed that one. The second 5-star book was one of my audiobooks that I listened to for the month, and that book is called Bitch on the Female of the Species. And this is by Lucy Cook. So she wrote The Truth About Animals, which is one of my favorite nonfictions. And this has now joined the ranks of my favorite nonfiction. And I don't know, like, I think this is a 5-star book. This is one of my favorite books ever. I love it. But I also feel like it is a book that was written almost exactly for me. So I don't know how many people will find this to be a 5-star experience, but if I have never said this on the channel, I'm not sure. My plan for life, my dream for life, what I had planned to do for most of my time throughout high school leading up to university was zoology or evolutionary biology. That was my huge passion. It's what I loved. I'd actually been accepted into school. I had paid like my residence fees, everything to go to a specific school to study that specific topic. And then for, various reasons, financial, etc., I ended up going to a different school. My schooling went in a different direction, and that is not what I did. However, reading this book, like Lucy Cook is my hero. Everything that she has done with her life sounds amazing, and I'm very happy with what I don't mean this to be like a super depressing, like, oh, my life went in such a bad direction. No, I'm very happy with the way that it went, but her book is like the culmination of all of my like teenage dreams, the things that I would have loved to do. And, you have that like tiny little spark in your heart where you're like, oh, this is such a dream job, dream career. And she is amazing. So this book basically is evolutionary biology meets feminism. So it is like two things that I'm absolutely, totally passionate about, just like colliding in nonfiction. And basically what it is it's an exploration of the females of various species. And it talks about a lot of common misconceptions in evolutionary biology, specifically surrounding survival of the fittest and sexual dimorphism and sexual selection, and how breeding and roles in nature are interpreted one way by the scientific community at large. But actually, if we kind of look past the data gap and we look past the sexism that has been inherent in the field of biology for the last several hundred years, we see an animal kingdom that is very different than the one we maybe learn about in school or university or even at the graduate level. So this was definitely a passion project for Lucy Cook, and I was the exact correct audience for it. So if you are interested in biology, and if you are interested in feminism and about the gender data gap, if you are interested in any of those things, then you should definitely listen to this book. If you don't care about those things, you'll probably find this book really boring. But I loved it. I could not stop listening to it. I think I listened to it within like a couple of days because I would just find excuses to be listening to it. Oh, I have to run an errand. Let me do that, Andrew. Like, I'll clean this up. I'll go for the walk. I'll do whatever it is we need to do because I just wanted to put on my headphones and listen to this book. It was perfect for me. So if you do listen to it, if you like those things and you do listen to it, please tell me what you think, because I don't really know who I can recommend this to, but I want to talk to somebody about it. After that, we have A Taste of Gold and Iron. So this is a romance novel. I gave this one 4.5 stars. This is a new release from this year that I picked up because I found out that the author is actually a fairly well-known fan fiction writer for the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation fan fiction community. So again, I feel like I've talked about this a bunch too, but I used to write a lot of fan fiction when I was young. I still read a fair amount of fan fiction. I feel like I am fairly embroiled in fandom in like an understated way, not in like a loud kind of way. I don't write anything anymore. I just kind of lurk at the edges. However, I have read fan fiction by this particular author and really enjoyed it. So when I saw that she was putting out a novel of her own, I was like, wow, I should really buy that and support her, etc. So I got it and I really enjoyed it. This is it's got a bunch of different tropes in it, but the setup basically is that you have a prince who is struggling with an anxiety disorder in an age where people don't really know what anxiety disorders are. So he struggles with kind of a daily oppressive anxiety, but then also has panic attacks, which intrude on his daily life. His biggest fear is being held responsible for the lives of other people. So he is really scared that his actions as a royal are going to have negative consequences for the people in his kingdom. And he is really happy because his sister, who is the ruler, is about to have a child. And so he's very excited that he is now kind of like one rung lower on this scheme of inheritance. His responsibility is now a tiny bit lower, but overall still feeling completely anxious. He gets caught up in some kind of political / court maneuverings, and there is an accident that happens that leads to the death of some of his friends. When this happens, his sister, who is the ruler, assigns him a bodyguard. And this bodyguard doesn't really know what happened for these other people to have lost their lives, but he believes that it's the prince's fault. So they start off with kind of an antagonistic relationship, or at least the bodyguard feels very antagonistic toward the prince. So it starts off as this kind of like enemies setup. Even though the prince himself doesn't dislike his bodyguard, he feels that the bodyguard is kind of justified in disliking him because he believes that he is a problem in many areas. Like, he does not have great self-esteem. He is unable to see his worthiness, and his anxiety has been playing a big role in kind of keeping him down. And it's really interesting because I think that over the last like decade or so, mental health has become a bigger conversation in fantasy novels at large. But this was one of the first books that I've read that really acknowledges the fact that if nobody knows what an anxiety disorder is, that could have some really negative repercussions for the person who is suffering, because they themselves often feel like their anxiety is their own fault. And then when people on the outside don't understand, it kind of compounds that. So it was a really interesting angle to take. And it seemed to be very true to life in terms of what people struggle with when they do have a generalized anxiety disorder, or if they do have panic disorder, or some combination of those two. So I really enjoyed that element of things. This is a good one to pick up if you like the enemies to lovers setup. If you don't like that, then you may not enjoy this. But the most important thing to note is that this is a slow burn. Like, this book is, I think it was around like 500 pages, and it is almost at the end of the book where we start seeing some kind of returns on that promise of romance. It is a very slow burn. There is much yearning, which I really like. I enjoy books where it's kind of like dragged out and it's a romance novel. You kind of know there are certain expectations of the genre, and those expectations are certainly met. But in this book, it takes a while to get there, and I really liked that. I enjoyed the tropes that were employed. In fantasy romance, which I don't read a lot of, there's always this balance of the plot against the romance, and I liked the plot here. Some of it is a little bit silly. So the villain is not incredibly well done. I think that the main characters and the secondary friendships are done very well. I really like all those characters. I think that they are pretty well-rounded and they're interesting, and I liked their interactions with each other. But the villain is where it's the weakest. Like, that is when the plot starts to get a little bit convenient. It starts to crumble a tiny bit. So if you are going in for like an intricate plot that has a resolution that's going to really awe you or grip you, you may not get that. I still think that the political part of the book is really interesting. Everything revolves around the economy, which is a different angle to take. And I thought that part was really interesting. But it is not the strongest villain story. It is not the strongest resolution at the end of the book. But the yearning. If you are in it for the angst, then I don't think you would be disappointed by this book. Like I said, I gave it 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I will buy a physical copy for myself, and I will definitely check out anything else that this author puts out. After that, so this is one of my buddy reads. I read Elric of Melnibone, which was the first in the Elric bind-up that I'm reading with Joanna and Evie and Andrew. And this I gave 3 stars. And I liked it. This book and the style that it is written in is something that I personally don't like. And it is this form of narration where the main character tells us their motivation for everything. So through the narration, we get this kind of internal monologue from the character that tells us exactly what's going to happen and why. So Elric will think like, I need to do this because they don't think I'm a real Melnibonean, and I need to do this to prove myself. And then once I do that, then these people will think this, and then it will have that repercussion. I do not like that style of writing. I like for the characters to do things and to interact with each other so that I have to be able to see through their actions, through their conversations, through the unfolding of the plot, how they are feeling. I do not want to be spoon-fed that information. I do not think that Michael Moorcock's writing is poor. I think that technically it's quite nice. It flows well. It's no trouble to make it through this book. It is just not a style that I enjoy. I don't think it lends to very good character development. This book is also quite short, and I know it's one in a long series, so obviously there's going to be time for Elric to grow and for me to appreciate more about him, but I did not like the focus of this book. Like, I think it was very plot focused, and while there are some cool concepts, I think I enjoyed them more as an academic exercise, as in seeing what has influenced some of the darker fantasy that has followed, as opposed to reading it and just loving it for what it was. But I'm going to continue along with the series, and I'm interested to see if my opinions change as I get more of Elric and I get to see more of what he does. After that, our very last one. So my very last book was also an audiobook. And it's funny because I messaged Kyle, because I always make fun of him and say that he reads his books on like 4 times speed because he reads like a bajillion a month. But this is the first time that I have increased an audiobook to 1.5 times speed, and it's because I wanted it to be over faster. And that is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is by Mark Twain. This was my 2.5-star book. And I have very mixed feelings on this book. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is a work of classic literature, and it is one of the first instances of portal fantasy in kind of Western / North American canon. So there is a man who is taken from our world and sucked into the past into King Arthur's court. So he ends up like wandering the English countryside, is kidnapped by a bunch of knights and brought to Arthur's court, and then like embarks on this series of misadventures. And it is a satire, a picaresque, whatever you would like to call it. It is kind of this bumbling, unfolding comedy that talks about a lot of the kind of political ideologies of Mark Twain, a lot of his opinions on politics and the economy and religion. And parts of it are really funny. And parts of it made me feel like Mark Twain was a forward thinker, someone who was far ahead of his time in terms of inclusivity and the way that he looked at the world. But then there would be moments where he would say or bring up topics where I'd be like, well, this is very 1800s of him, like this. And it would totally take me out of the story because it would be things that were uncomfortable or that I didn't really enjoy or agree with. Not that I need to agree with everything that comes up in a book, but it was just things that I feel like if he were alive today, he probably would not be writing about. Also, it was too long. So it was a fun idea. It was funny, but it dragged. And there were definitely full chapters, full parts of the novel where I didn't feel like anything new was being accomplished. I feel like this could have been much shorter. It could have been a novella. And it just dragged on too long for me. So unfortunately, it did not make my list of favorite classics. But if you have read it, then I would love to know your opinions on it. Is this one that you really like? Do you not enjoy it? I haven't actually talked to a lot of people who have read this one, so it would be interesting to know. But that's it. That is my September wrap up. Like I said, tons of books that I really enjoyed. And even the ones like Elric and A Connecticut Yankee that I didn't rate as highly, I don't feel disappointed that I read either one of them. I still enjoyed the process of reading them, and I am looking forward at least to reading more of Michael Moorcock. So please let me know what you read in September. If you read and enjoyed or didn't enjoy any of these books, then feel free to let me know, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!